My name's Blake Hargreaves, and this is Future Stops. You're hearing the unmistakable sound of the Hammond B-3 organ, an instrument that, in the decades following its invention, changed the sound of music in both the sacred and the secular worlds. Starting as a less expensive alternative to the pipe organs that were out of reach for working-class black Christian churches, the Hammond organ seemed to have a unique ability to sonically fit into the creation of a black gospel tradition during the Great Migration, as if it enhanced a particular black spiritual identity and ultimately was instrumental in spreading and shaping that identity as it infiltrated the secular arts. Today on Future Stops, we explore the history of this versatile instrument and the impact it has both on the world of music in general and on one of our favorite organ players, Alcée Chriss, who grew up hearing and eventually playing a Hammond organ, accompanying Sunday morning masses.
Well, it's really interesting because it's hard to know when some facts and realities come into your, existence when you're a child. But my dad is a United Methodist minister. He was at the time. And I grew up basically going to church every Sunday. But I was way more familiar with the piano just because it was an instrument that was pretty, easily understandable to me. But I knew of the existence of this two manual monster, this two keyboard monster that, quite frankly, now that I think about it, I must have been quite intimidated of it. And now that I know later, that was actually a Hammond organ. It was like a light brown Hammond organ from the 1950s or 60s. And, all I knew is that the thing just had so much capability. And I was so eager to learn how to play it. This was at Morningside United Methodist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. So funny, I never thought I'd mention that church again. But that was the church I most remember as a child growing up. Once I was able to make memories, it was at that church. And because my mother was in the choir, I was often dragged along to choir rehearsal. And this is where I think these instruments sort of came into my being without me really even having a lot of agency of it, because my own introduction into music all seemed very, very natural. So I think this was probably the inception moment for what I am today, was my experiences at this church as a young kid. It was probably less the organ itself and more its function in the service. I mean, it was a very powerful instrument. I kind of understood, the power it could have to kind of take over the entire atmosphere or really add to the atmosphere of worship. And this was a, not super Pentecostal, but definitely on the line of being kind of Baptist-y black church. So a lot of drums, we had a drummer, tambourine, people would be dancing. Very rhythmic music, gospel music, we would call it. So it wasn't just the instrument itself, it was also the medium that was just so a part of my being, the gospel music. It was like almost a part of the identity, my Christian identity and my racial identity in some ways. The Hammond organ was like, it felt, I hate to say, in my little reality in Texas where I was surrounded by a lot of black people, it seemed to me like it was a black organ. And I say that cautiously because I know there are plenty of artists of many different races who have made it sing.
The history of this instrument in working-class black culture originates in Chicago, where the first Hammond organ was made in 1935. In the years after this, Reverend Clarence Cobbs starts to incorporate the organ, amplified by 4 Leslie speakers, into his services at the now legendary First Church of Deliverance on the south side of Chicago. Johari Jabir is an associate professor of Black Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He studies the history of this instrument and its place in working-class black culture, tracing it right back to those Sunday services on the south side of Chicago.
When Reverend Cobbs and First Church remodeled this new version of the church at 43rd and Wabash, which is where it is now, the inside of the church has a very ornate altar. So it has the look of an Episcopal kind of high Anglican church on the inside. But then you have this instrument that has the capacity to sound very Gothic. And the way that you achieve that playing at First Church is you turn the pedals up, you emphasize the pedal work. So that makes the sound very dark. But also what it does is if they're singing something upbeat with a kind of swing, you could hear somebody playing that instrument and the pedal work sounds like walking in acoustic space. So it means that the organ is facilitating a kind of black syncretism of sorts. This church looks like this one thing, but the culture of the music is the blues, it's jazz, it's all of these other things. And so what captured my mind is how this instrument becomes a kind of ritual instrument for a sense of black holiness. And I don't mean holiness in the sense of doctrine or denomination. I mean the way that music ushers in the presence of the divine among people. But what I'm never lost on is that Black people are creating a medicine out of poison. It was never the intention that enslaved Black Africans would be able to even be Christians. That was never the intention. And so it is always that the religion of these Black working class people is a great example for how religion is creative and dynamic and not static. So it means that, for example, someone like Reverend Cobbs, who I regard as a kind of mystic and even, a contemplative kind of person, he is arriving from the South. And many of these folks are arriving in, this first chapter of the Great Migration, and they are bringing with them kind of folk magic of spirituality, forms of conjure, and they have a liturgical sense, a sense of worship that allows for mystery, right? And so the ambiance at First Church and the way this instrument accompanies that sensibility of a Black folk religion come up north. And First Church was very unique. It is a spiritual church, and that is a particular strain in Black Christianity that allows for the metaphysical, but also the mystical. So the organ, the Hammond B-3 helped to facilitate that.
The unique spiritual character of this church was matched by a unique form of outreach, a syndicated radio broadcast of Sunday services that could be heard all across the United States.
Well, the process has very much to do with the radio popularity of First Church. There is a version of the Lord's Prayer that actually, hearing how it was arranged by one of the conductors at First Church, that version of the Lord's Prayer took root in churches across the country. So radio helped to facilitate a particular Black style of worship that was emblematic of Reverend Cobbs and First Church. It was literally a place, a church that embraced everybody from all backgrounds, unlike many Chicago Black churches that were very much about class.
Well, to be honest with you, I was really bad at the Hammond organ when I first tried it. And I think it's because it was like I had to learn a lot more about harmony before I was ready to tackle the beast. So for me, some pretty elementary introductions to the organ, like basically playing hymns and things like that. But it's like even learning the drawbars, like I had no idea. Like all I was going off of is like shapes I had seen the other organists do. Like I didn't even understand the concept of like, how much you measure out a pipe to get what pitch. So there was a lot of like guesswork. It was almost like an unknown machine that I was learning to navigate. But I tell you, the more I got these church songs into my system and I got these revolving harmonies into my system, the more I felt really at home.
The way that it was taught to me is that church music has to have a very expansive diet. And so as a musician, you had to graduate to different levels, but the beginning was the hymns. You had to learn the hymns first and foremost. And you had to learn them very simply, not a lot of room for razzmatazz or extras, but you had to learn them because it is shaping you to be an accompanist.
In the pipe organ world, as far as sort of mainstream Protestant Catholic religion, the organ has the role of coming in when it's supposed to. And in some cases, a lot of people do improvise on the pipe organ to fill in time. But there's really sort of an established structure for how the service will go, and the organ is supposed to serve its role in those places. And that goes all the way back, to 17th century France and their genres for organ. They were always specified for a part of the service. I think in the Black church, what I picked up on really early on is that the organist actually has the job of accompanying pretty much the entire service. And it's very few times where the organ will ever be told to shut up, which I find very interesting, which is that the pastor really expects that the organist is going to follow sort of the tone that he set up. And there's kind of this tug and pull between building tension either through a sermon or through, if it's a testimony or something, where you're wondering, okay, is the pastor ready for me to pick up the energy? And so you're taking these signs from each other, and it's this dynamic process where you can really, have the people to come along with you as you're sort of teasing the emotion. So the kind of organ you would play before the service for a prayer will be very different than what you're going to play at the climax of past sermon. You know what I mean?
In the context that I was raised, these people had a way of going from in one service. It felt like we started in a monastic space, but we ended in the juke joint. It was quite remarkable, and we began, and we were talking about the flexibility that in a service for a place like First Church, you'd have a very high church anthem, but you'd also have a really gritty gospel in the same service. So I was very much shaped as a young musician by that same aesthetic. You really are, when you're playing it, it is an intuition that you learn when to make these adjustments. That's different than when you're reading a score for an organ piece and okay, I pull this stop now, because it tells you to do that. Yeah, and so this kind of intuition, I think for the best organ Hammond B-3 players, as I've listened over the years, it means that, depending how seriously you take that this is a kind of priestly work on this instrument. I know there are certain ways that I can adjust that instrument, and there are things that I can do that can push this preacher to another level.
And it's really interesting because they actually follow some pretty simple conventions on the surface, some pretty simple chord progressions that you could go from church to church and say, this is how it goes. But the problem is that this is very much a oral tradition. So you just learn by listening. And I think that is where I'm trying to catch up a lot, is because there's so much that I know, but that I really want to understand at a deeper level, because it's not written down. And it's not that I write these things down, but now that I find myself having to teach my students, they like, oh, can you teach me how to play this Corey Henry lick? Things like that. And I'm like, well, yeah, I can hear it and I can play it, but to explain to you how to do it and what's going on here, I think that's the tough part with the gospel music, which is you have to be a part of the lived tradition. You have to know the pastor, and you have to be in that moment of creating a spiritual atmosphere to really understand the concept of how the organ is used.
These Africans who come from many different tribes and a diverse language, right? And they are brought here involuntarily into this land of volunteerism. It is always a paradox. And the question that always holds me is, how are they able to make a Black community out of so much diversity? Well, in part, they all have this musical sensibility that is practiced in the ring shout, the counterclockwise song, dance, drum, and story. And, arriving on a plantation where you don't know the language, what you are given immediately is likely a tool. And so what do the already present population of those enslaved people do? Is that they've already been creating songs about those tools and about those tasks. Well, that's a knowledge. That's a way of knowing to do that. And that helped to create a oneness out of a vast diversity. So that's a part of the cargo on those ships as well, is this knowledge, this way of knowing.
As a tool for music making, the Hammond organ has unique characteristics which were considered imperfections by the company. When they updated the instrument's mechanical technology to solid state in the 1970s, people lost interest in it and the company went bankrupt in 1985. The mechanical technology that was so beloved revolves around the rotating tone wheel, which is a sort of magnetic gear whose teeth vibrate a pickup to produce sound electrically. When tone wheels right next to each other play simultaneously, we hear the sound of tone wheel leakage, which adds tones and overtones to the played pitches, enriching the sound with what Jabir calls grit.
The pipe organ cannot achieve the grit that the Hammond does. I think that grit really the evidence of Black working class aesthetics. It goes back to where we earlier spoke about syncretism, and what I see in the spirituality of this culture, is an embrace of sensuality, though not at the sacrifice of intellectualism. So both the sort of erotic and the intellectual. And as it pertains to the Hammond organ, here's an instrument that they would have, at the start of the service, would have sounded very high church. But by midway through, it would have, been very down home. So they're not dividing. You understand what I mean? They're not making the division that it's only this thing. Having an instrument that can do more than one thing, helps to facilitate a consciousness that is open and not loyal to one particular thing at the opposition of another.
When I was playing for my dad, of course, we didn't use music for anything. It was all played by ear. It was all played in like a R&B gospel or jazzy style. What happened when I went to play the pipe organ, at least in the professional setting, is that there were a lot of rules, like a lot. And it was jarring. And I didn't really fight it at first. I wasn't like, oh, I want to do this. I think I was pretty eager to be like, oh, let me figure out how this is actually supposed to be done. So I was like a sponge. It's like I really wanted to learn the way you're supposed to, quote unquote, play the organ. But like I was saying, the starkest difference was that, especially for congregational singing, they did not want you to deviate much from what was written on the score. It's just this idea that the harmony is always supposed to be very, very clear where you're going, where you're at. In most cases, you have people singing in parts. They have to play each voice and each hand the right way every time. Don't, mess it up. Well, this is kind of hard because I've been hardwired to do the exact opposite thing. Because on the Hammond organ, I think the thing that marks the style of playing is that harmony is basically kind of a puddle, I think you could say. It's a bit of a puddle because any relations you might have between, dominant key structures. I mean, I don't hope I'm not getting too technical here, but if you're in a key, you're considered being in the one, and you have many predominants and dominants you can use. You can go to the 4 or to the 5. But the thing is, in the Black church, you kind of just combine it all. So like there's just highly, highly, highly saturated dominant chords because it builds tension and it is not so clear where you're going. So when you have more saturated textures, you really can move harmony in ways that you can't when you're using 4-part, hymn-like harmony. So that means that you're constantly kind of having the ability to play with people's expectations harmonically. And I think it's that aspect of total like harmonic saturation that really kind of I had to turn off a little bit on the pipe organ. But the funny thing is that playing those hymns in 4 parts, it was actually really easy for me to improvise in a classical style because when you learn the gospel harmonies, and when you go back to 4-part harmony, it's really kind of like going on vacation. You know what I mean? It's often harder for me to get some of the more difficult gospel substitutions that I might hear in certain recordings because you really have to like listen for every single note. You're like, oh man, what is that cool color he's got there? And in most cases, it might be a 10-note chord.
It's a quickness, it's a really sharp break that the Hammond can do in a much shorter time. And it also has kind of piercing that it can do because it has a really quick way to adjust the tremolo and the vibrato. So that in and of itself, if we think of how people hear music, right, as a sound wave and vibration. So my sense is that, somebody who plays it, and I'm more of a pianist than an organist, but those vibrations that the Hammond can access more easily, I think make it distinct.
I was taking a Hammond organ lesson once, and I was asking the guy how to spell, a simple D flat chord. And the guy gets on the thing and he basically plays every single black key on the organ. And it's like, this really saturated chord with 9s and 7s and kind of a lot of what we would call polytonality. It's always as if you're in D flat major, for instance, you're always strongly implying F minor over it, which is just a jazz thing to do to imply the minor 3 over a major 1. But it's taken to the extreme almost always. So yeah, it's really interesting, but also the notion that you have to control the dynamics far more dramatically than you would if you were playing the pipe organ. So using the Leslie and using, the drawbars, kind of like almost using them more than you actually play the notes. I mean, you can look at some Hammond players, they'll be holding one note for a minute and, hitting drawbars for another 2. So it's also using the instrument's dynamic range to your benefit. In a lot of cases, some of the best Hammond organ playing is not what's being done on the keyboards, but what they're doing with dynamics and what we would call the toys of the instrument. And people react to that immediately because it's almost like the conventions of a singer. The ability to have the vibrato to go really slow to really fast, or to go from a tiny little whisper up to, the roaring Hammond sound within a matter of seconds. It's just immediately gets people moving. And I don't know why that is, but it's it has the power to literally change people in the moment. It's pretty amazing.
Alcée's love of the Hammond and his upbringing playing gospel music in a Texas church colors his approach to the pipe organ. At the Canadian International Organ Competition in 2017, where Alcée took home the grand prize, he surprised the judges and audience alike by performing an Art Tatum composition he arranged for pipe organ in the final round, straying far beyond the repertoire one would expect at a competition of this nature.
As of recently, my favorite Tatum transcription that I've made is the T for Two, because it's just so fun and so virtuosic, and it just works really well on the organ. If we want to get into the technicalities of the arrangement, the most difficult part is to get the stride piano sound on the organ, which you would think would be easy, right? Because you have a foot, you can play the bass in your foot. The problem is that you don't have that quick percussive sound readily available in the middle range of the organ. You know what I mean? It's like once you drop below middle C, which is a very good sounding area for the tenor range of the piano, where you get that stride sound of the bass kind of plucking and then having those inner voices in the, upper fingers of the left hand. It's really difficult because it's that to get that sound of like doom chop, boom chop is actually quite difficult on the organ. So then what I elected to do was to actually take the idiom itself backwards a little bit, to say, okay, let's do more of a Fats Waller idiom that kind of did work, the sort of like boom chop bass with the more percussive thing in the left hand. So it became like Fats Waller, like in the skeletal version, but all the meat and potatoes on the arrangement was Tatum, because all the harmonies were Tatum and not all the licks were Tatum. I didn't fully transcribe it. There's a lot of stuff in there. I would say probably half of it is not Tatum. There's only like a couple of specific licks that are like ripped straight from him. A lot of it is just taking his harmonic structures, which are freaking amazing, and just playing around those. The other thing being is that some of those Tatum licks are so far flung down the piano, they have to be either recomposed or brought down the octave because they just go out of the range of the organ. And in some cases, I actually sampled like classical organ pieces. There's like a random snippet of Vierne 5, like a random chord progression from Vierne 5 in there. So I kind of bring all of my influences into that arrangement. What I like is what I put down in there. But I think for the T for Two, the way we mic'd it, and plus, me doing that super full percussive effect, it works. And I'll tell you one trick I'm doing, which is very unheard of. I'm basically coupling all of the dissonant mutations. Like I'm talking the gross tiers, the septième, all the really, the quint 5 1/3, basically using all of those in the pedal, trying to get as much pop as humanly possible. I over register the pedal. I have to. I take it up to its very limit without using reeds, because you have to have the boo, like you have to be able to hear that bass drum. You know what I mean? With every downbeat. And then in the hands, in the left hand, I'm using like reed stops, and they're all very short attacks, like as short as possible to give the strum of the guitar. It's like doom, 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 chuka, doom, doom. So you'll hear that in the left hand. And then the right hand, of course, has the percussive effect, which kind of gives you the Hammond. So you have those 3 layers, and they pretty much don't really deviate. You've got melody, you've got accompaniment, and you've got bass, which is not at all how Tatum probably would have conceived of it, even though that's what it looks like on the skeletal structure.
You're listening to the FutureStops podcast, an initiative of the Royal Canadian College of Organists. My name is Blake Hargreaves, and I'm your host as we explore the world of the 21st century organ. We just heard today's feature piece, an arrangement of Art Tatum's Tea for Two by Alcée Chriss from his most recent release, Art and Rhapsody. The recording was made on the Montreal Symphony House organ, which has a special feature that aided in the difficult process of adapting a ragtime piano piece for the pipe organ.
The way I had to register that piece was so that I could get somewhat of like a half piano, half Hammond sound as far as percussive effect. I actually, now this is really interesting. What I did to mimic a Hammond effect in that recording is that I found out a trick on the Montreal Symphony Hall organ. You can actually turn the organ down a key. You can transpose it. And if you transpose it, the percussive effects don't transpose with it. So you actually have the ability to, in theory, have any percussive interval off of any note you're playing. So I made it an interval that's actually kind of really dissonant to the ear. I made it a minor second, if I'm not mistaken. But what that did is it added that percussive shimmer that we all kind of, associate with the Hammond organ, is that you have that point of attack, which may not have anything to do with the actual tone that's going to be held, but it gives you that sense of rhythm that is always missing. So my first thought is, okay, what kind of shadow areas? I kind of talk to my students about that. It's like these areas, these key areas that are close enough that they match the bass, but they're not saying, okay, boom, we're in G major. So you can saturate the chords with what we would call the major six. And in some cases on chords, you can just straight up play a major seventh instead of a major chord. So you immediately put dissonant notes into the texture. Because on the Hammond, it's the dissonant notes, the carefully picked dissonant notes that give you that flavor and also that sense of being suspended. It doesn't need to be in rhythm. The people don't need the rhythm before on the Hammond organ. As opposed to on the pipe organ, you have to make sure that they hear the speed of the hymn because it's never going to change.
Speaking with Johari and Alcée about the fascinating history of this instrument is illuminating. Their research, knowledge, and experience opens up the story of the Hammond organ. The image of a Chicago church in the 1930s with a reverend hauling in a Hammond B-3 and 4 Leslie speakers to animate the service with quadraphonic live sound at the very birth of stereo technology is inspiring. It also gives a lot of credence to the idea that the Hammond is really the beginning of electronic music and rock and roll, because it predates the widespread popularity of the electric guitar, introducing distortion and compression to the modern listener. We'd like to thank Johari Jabir and Alcée Chriss for joining us this week and sharing their knowledge, and thank Alcée for performing the music you heard in today's show. We'd also like to thank Dr. Don Cummings for providing our intro music today, a track from Black Flower, an album by the Back Talk Organ Trio. Do you have a favorite Hammond recording? If so, we'd invite you to post a link on the FutureStops Facebook page where we can have an ongoing discussion about the many legendary performances in so many genres of the Hammond organ. FutureStops is a podcast from the Royal Canadian College of Organists, produced by Andrew O'Connor, with Haley Raymond as community manager, and executive producer Elizabeth Shannon. I'm your host, Blake Hargreaves. Thank you for listening.